Thank you very much for coming, and first of all I would like to thank Professor Brozai, Professor Stenmark for the kind invitation, and Professor Wolensky for being here. Thank you very much for coming. Okay, today, yes, I will speak about social ontology. Mainly, this is the main topic of my work, namely that part of philosophy which is currently dealing with the reality of social facts. So how we can account for this kind of reality, and how social facts are different from natural facts, obviously, and other kinds of facts. So there is a lot of work in philosophy made on this specific topic, for example by philosophers like Margaret Gilbert and John Searle, obviously, and Raimo Tuomela and others, and also in legal philosophy, for example by philosophers such as Neil McCormick and Eric Lagerspitz and the like. Yes, I usually start from Searle's paradigm and Searle's theory, because I think it's the most simple, and it has the strongest explanatory power. And what I will do today is first to present Searle's theory of institutional concepts. Here, institutional is a very broad term in Searle's view. It means basically social facts or social concepts, or a specific kind of social concepts. Then I will explain how that theory should be amended and extended. And here the example of chess is quite simple and is a good way, in my view, to explain what is relevant. And then I will show, and this is the most important part in my view, that this analysis leads to what might be a new concept for social philosophy and legal philosophy, that of institutional mimesis, and this is what I will speak about today. Okay, so let's start with Searle's theory. I assume that some of you know this theory, but actually this quotation can be a good short version of Searle's idea regarding the social world. He says that there are three primitive notions that are required to account for social facts. The first is collective intentionality. The second is the assignment of function, status function in his view. And third, a language rich enough to enable the creation of status function declarations, which means including constitutive rules. So three notions: collective intentionality, status function, and constitutive rules. Basically, the idea of Searle is that social facts are created by means of rules, and these rules attribute a function to a given object, but this is a status function, namely a function that the object cannot fulfill by means of his physical makeup, but only by virtue of collective acceptance. So this is why collective intentionality is relevant. And this is done basically through rules, constitutive rules. So the structure of his idea is: we collectively recognize or accept that X, which is a sort of brute element, counts as Y, this is the social, the institutional element, in context, say. For example, an act made according to this or that procedure counts as marriage in the legal system, say. Okay, this is the idea. So, this is very basic, in a sense, and obviously it's a very rough picture of Searle's theory and of all we can say about social ontology. But I would like to raise some criticism on Searle's theory in order to explain some points which are really crucial in my view. The first one is this: When we speak about constitutive rules, that is, rules that should be constitutive of concepts, that is, social and institutional concepts, we cannot take into account only what counts as that concept. Namely, the conditions through which that concept is instantiated or given institutional social acts are performed. I think that, and I'm not alone in this, the normative consequences of that concept are equally relevant, and so there are two elements for creating a social and institutional concepts. The conditions in order to instantiate it, in order to perform it, okay? And the normative consequences. What is its import? What does it mean in normative sense? For example, let's take the simple example of games, okay? When you have checkmate in chess, for example, there are two elements which are relevant for checkmate, the concept of checkmate. The first one is how checkmate is performed, which is X. The second element is what is checkmate, what does it mean? The fact is that checkmate entails victory in chess. And so this is element Z. So we have three elements. The institutional one, the rule constituted one, is Y, checkmate, and then you have conditions for performing checkmate and its import. Okay. Sorry. This is the first criticism. Obviously, it's not a very strong one, because Searle can object that this element is already included in his concept of status function, and that's fine. But there is another point that I raise against Searle's theory in social ontology, and this is that, in my view, Searle considers constitutive rule in vitro, so to say, so as something which is detached from the context in which these constitutive rules are created. His idea seems to be that if there is collective acceptance and if there is a structure like this, then you can have the creation of social facts. Okay, what I would like to say is that this is not true in my view, and I think that collective acceptance and constitutive rules need some limits, some boundaries, some constraints in order to work properly. And this is why I have made in these years a research on three kinds of constraints to constitutive rules, which I would like to show with regard to the example of chess. The first one, consider a constitutive rule of chess that says the color red counts as the king in chess. This is a real problem, because red is a color, is nothing like an object that can be manipulated on a chessboard, for example. Even when you play chess on electronic devices, it's not the color red that counts as the king in chess, obviously. And so here, it seems that there are some constraints to the constitutive power of rules of an ontological kind. Something cannot simply count as the king in chess. This is relevant for all kinds of normative orders, because obviously if in normative orders you have to create normative concepts by means of constitutive rules, then simply there are some ontological constraints in those rules. The same, and the second example is even easier. Consider a rule that says the king cannot be attacked in chess. This rule cannot work in chess, because in this way nobody could win. Nobody could checkmate the king. Okay. Here, simply, there are some features of the structure of the game that make this rule impossible. This is a failure as a rule of chess. And these are structural constraints, that is, they depend on the feature of the normative order. Here we have an ontological problem, here we have a structural problem, namely a problem with relations to other institutional elements. The third problem, the third kind of constraints, arise when the rule denies, in a sense, not some kind of ontology, nor the structure of the normative order, but what? The broader pragmatic context in which the normative order is embedded. For example, consider a rule such as that any move of the king counts as victory in chess. This is a failure. Why? Because in that case, chess would not even be a game, a competitive game. It would be absolutely trivial. So, these are three kinds of different constraints to rules and to the constitution of normative concepts, which I am explaining by means of the simple example of chess. But all these three kinds show different things and have different features. For example, let's start with the last. Pragmatic constraints. What pragmatic constraints show is that constitutive rules are not alone. They must be embedded in a broader social practice, that is, in this case, the broader social practice of competitive game playing. You cannot have constitutive rules making all the work in creating the concept of chess. You have two elements, the rules of chess, but also the concept of competitive game playing. And the two things must be connected, okay? Again, this is relevant for all kinds of normative order, because this is to say that you cannot have only the rules, but also the broader concept of what the order is for, okay? This is interesting because this is a problem that, for example, in social ontology, nobody, to my knowledge, has dealt with. The contextual element, the role that the social practice has in the construction of normative concepts. For example, consider a paradoxical mental experiment that has been raised by Hubert Schweitzer in a very, very good paper of 1969, which is called Rules and Practices, I believe. And he says, chess, in a very strange culture, chess could be a ritual. A religious ritual, and then the rules could be the same. But Schweitzer seems to say, and he says actually, if chess were a ritual, then the meaning of the concepts which are embedded in chess would be different, even if the constitutive rules of chess would be the same. Okay? So there are these two elements. Okay, what about ontological constraints? I do not want to be boring here, so I will try to show you what I have done. I have identified two kinds of ontological constraints, internal and contextual. You have a problem, for example, with that rule, the color red counts as the king in chess. That is an internal problem. That is, X, the color red, cannot count as the king, simply because a color cannot fulfill the import of the king, namely that of being a piece, that of being something that you can manipulate on the chessboard and the like. So that is a sort of internal ontological constraint. But there are other kinds of ontological constraints that are relevant for contextual or again pragmatic reason. For example, consider this one. Slapping the opponent's face counts as checkmate in chess. This is a problem, but for pragmatic reason, in the sense that this could be considered as contradictory with the point of game playing, at least if we consider game playing as something that should be done for enjoyment and the like. Okay, so ontological constraints can be of two kinds, at least, in my view. What about structural constraints? Okay, structural constraints simply show that there are relations of dependence among institutional elements. And this is trivial from the point of view of normative orders. But what should be, in my view, pointed out is that if this holds for norms, this holds for rules which are constitutive of concepts too. So for constitutive rules as well. And so, for example, consider this rule. If the king could not be attacked, checkmate would be impossible, obviously. And here there is a dependence between the conditions of checkmate and the king import. The fact that the king can be attacked and so is an important piece in the game. But there are also relations of dependence, for example, of this kind. If the king and the rooks did not start the game on the first rank of the chessboard, then castling, the move of the king and the rook, would be impossible. This is the difference. This is a dependence between the conditions for performance of the king and conditions of performance of the rook. And this one, if the king could not move, then attacking the king could not force the king to move, and this is dependence between the import of the king and the import of attacking. So, these are three kinds of structural constraints. What is relevant in my view is that these constraints should be taken into account in dealing with how constitutive rules create normative concepts, are sort of a priori constraints. Okay. Now, I am here to speak about mimesis, and this is something that has not been raised in social ontology so far, and it's basically an idea of mine, and I would be glad to know your opinion about it. Okay, I think that there can be in normative orders another kind of constraints, and this kind can be defined as follows. Constitutive rules are subject to mimetic constraints when, for some reason, in creating an institution, they imitate an aspect of a given pre-existing social or natural reality. So, as you know, rules can create some kind of concepts and hence new kinds of institutional facts or objects. But then what I'm interested in is when this process through which constitutive rules create those concepts imitate something that went before. And I will give 3 examples. This is an interesting example. It's taken from a book which was written by a Dominican friar during the 13th century. It's called the Book of Chess. The title is much longer in Latin. And Jacopo da Searle thought, for example, that chess existed because they were, in a sense, representative of something. And he thought, this was a quite influential book in chess theory in the Middle Age. He thought that the reason why the rules of chess are these is because the social order is this. So, for example, he says, the black king stands on the 4th square of the board. To his right there is a knight on the white square, and an elder, the bishop, and the rook on the black squares. And then he says, because knights represent the king's honor and crown, and the knight on the right stands on the same color square as the king, because knights, they represent the king's honor and crown, the knight on the right stands on the same color square as the king. So the sameness of color is mimetic of what? Of the fact that the knights represent the king's honor. The whole of the kingdom is governed best by this arrangement. Obviously, this is a sort of paradoxical example in the sense that it's made only to show you what I'm meaning. The fact is that what about chess in effect were created to imitate a social reality, a pre-existing social reality? In this case, for example, we have a strange kind of performative mimesis. Why? Because determining the initial positions of chess elements is something which is made by means of mimetic relations. I am here the initial positions, so the first part, the X part of the constitutive rule, is determined by means of mimetic relation, and I call this performative mimesis. Okay, so a given entity has some kind of deontic feature, in this case obviously. The king and the knight, they have some kind of normative relation in the social reality, and the king must represent, the knight must represent the king's honor, and hence the performance or realization, the initial position in the game of Y, the king in chess, mimics that pre-existing feature. Okay. In this case, obviously, we are dealing with chess, which is a very simple example. And in this case, too, sorry, this is another way to explain this. In this case, the kind of mimesis that Jacopo is envisaging in chess did not have a role in the institution's creation, in the sense that Jacopo is trying to justify, in a sense, ex post, why the constitutive rules of chess are made in this way. This is typical, even if you look at the history of legal philosophy. There is a lot of work which is made in order to justify the constitutive rules of a given institution by means of reference, for example, of a natural order or a natural reality and the like. So this is a kind of mimesis in effect, but it's not something that had a real role in the development of the institution. This is something that simply is used ex post to justify the institution. And this is why I tend to distinguish between two kinds of mimesis. Hermeneutic, in the sense that some authors can take the institution and interpret it as mimetic with, for example, a pre-existing reality, very often to justify its rules. Hermeneutic, institutional mimesis on the one hand, and on the other hand, genetic institutional mimesis. So my question is, can it be that mimetic relations had a role in the development and emergence of institutions? This is the case, for example, with this interesting example by Searle. He imagined a tribe that builds a wall around its cluster of huts, where the wall performs the function of restricting access. We then imagine that the wall decays until nothing is left but a line of stones. But let us suppose that the inhabitants continue to recognize the line of stones as having a certain status. And this becomes a boundary. And they continue to recognize that they are not supposed to cross the boundary. So there was a wall, and then there is the boundary. So this is a kind of mimesis, in the sense that the constitutive rules of the boundary, which is an institutional concept, in a sense mimic what happened before the wall and the constitution, the creation of the wall. But here there is a mimesis which has not to do only with the with how the wall was made, but has to do with what was the meaning of the wall. There are two kinds of interpretation here. The first one is that the tribe thought that the wall could not be passed in a deontic sense, and then the boundary is not, it's not supposed to be crossed, okay? And this is a kind of normative mimesis. But there is another one, and I will skip to that. Searle is saying the wall was too high to climb over easily. And then the citizens recognize that they are not supposed to cross the boundary. Here, something different happens. In the previous examples, I was mentioning deontic or normative features of the social reality, and then the normative features of institutional concepts. Here, I am speaking about a mimetic relation between the normative features of the boundary, which is something that you are not supposed to cross, on the one hand, and something which is not normative, something which has to do with the features of natural reality, with the feature of the world, which is an artifactual reality, obviously. This is an impossibility, obviously. Something that you cannot do because the wall is too high. So, here, a given entity has some alectic. I have called it alectic in a very broad sense, in the sense that it was impossible to climb the wall in natural reality. And the import of the institutional concept mimics those alectic features in a normative way, in the sense that it's not impossible, but it's something that you should not do. Okay? Deontic versus alectic institutional mimesis. This is the difference. Okay. This is the table that I have come up with. Different kinds of mimesis on the basis of different kinds of questions. Had the institutional mimesis a role, a real effective role in the genesis of the institution? If yes, it's a kind of genetic mimesis. If not, it's a kind of hermeneutic mimesis. In that case, it's used for justification, basically. Which element of the Count-Size formula is mimicked? Performative versus normative. And does the relation of mimesis hold between deontic or also alectic features? Deontic mimesis versus alectic mimesis. So, I am near to the end, hopefully. I think that alectic mimesis is by far the most interesting in terms of explanatory power. In the sense that when I arrived at this concept, then a lot of conjectures came up to my mind, and so this is why I would like to know your opinion about this. What if the development and genesis of our institutions and our basic social concepts mimic genetically some natural features of reality that can be expressed through modal statements? What if, for example, some examples, these are conjectures. You know that the selection of archaic things in archaic normative orders was made in terms of factual capacities or ability, beauty, swiftness, strength. So, my question, is the institutional power of kings originally mimetic of factual power over things and persons? You know that in archaic normative orders, judges had a sort of sacral or even godlike role. Yeah. So, can we formulate a let's say, argue for a conjecture showing that legal trials were originally mimetic of struggles between individuals decided by the gods. Another, the confusion between the concept of natural order and that of natural law in pre-Socratic philosophy. You can find a lot of fragments in which decay is something which is very much intertwined with ananke, necessity. So, is the Greek concept of decay, rightness, justice, mimetic? Does it genetically derive from the concept of ananke, necessity? And more in general, would it be senseless to conceive deontic concepts such as power, prohibitions and duties as mimetic and genetically deriving from model concepts and capabilities, impossibilities and the like? So, these are questions obviously, but there is an important and sense in which these questions extend what has been called a captivating idea, for example regarding the nature of mathematical entities. I am quoting from Professor Brosek's book Rule Following. He is describing Lakoff and Nunez's conception regarding embodied mathematics. He says that in the embodied paradigm, metaphors are understood as the means for understanding and experiencing one kind of things in terms of another. And so important is conceptualized in terms of size and the like. And this is a quotation from their book. There are metaphors that link abstract mathematical concepts to concrete capabilities, and each such conceptual metaphor has the same structure. Each is a unidirectional mapping from entities in one conceptual domain to corresponding entities in another conceptual domain, and these are linked through metaphors. And so conceptual metaphors are part of our system of thought. And this is what Brosek says about them, and I agree with him. They do offer an account of how to get from the limited innate mathematical capacities to full-blooded mathematics, from the concrete basic capabilities to abstract mathematical concepts. So, my question is this idea of metaphor linking the concrete domain to abstract domain within an embodied paradigm, can this idea be extended to the development of social and institutional concepts? Can genetic mimesis, in particular alectic genetic mimesis, explain the genesis of abstract deontic institutional concepts as a metaphoric process, in the same sense as Lakoff and Nunez say about mathematical entities? Thank you very much.